Johnny Cash did not only hurt himself. That is the sentence the legend keeps trying to soften. The world remembers the black suit, the prison concerts, the deep voice, the comeback, and the love story with June Carter. Very convenient. But before Johnny Cash became America's favorite wounded man, there were people standing close enough to be burned by him. A wife waiting, children watching, bandmates covering, a courthouse photograph, a suitcase full of pills, and a voice so deep it made pain sound noble, even when that pain had an address, a witness, and a family name. That is the harder story. Because Johnny Cash was not fake. His pain was real. His faith was real. His compassion for prisoners, the poor, and the broken was real. He knew shame because he had lived inside it. But pain does not harmless just because a man can sing it beautifully. Sometimes pain leaks. Sometimes it walks into the kitchen. Sometimes it misses birthdays. Sometimes it leaves a woman alone with children, while strangers applaud the man who caused the silence. That is the problem with legends. They clean the room before showing you the photograph. Cash became a symbol of redemption. A man who fell, crawled, prayed, relapsed, returned, and sang like he had seen both hell and home. Audiences loved that. Of course they did. Redemption is one of America's favorite products, especially when it comes with a guitar. But redemption has a shadow. Someone has to live through the damage before the comeback looks inspiring. For Johnny Cash, that someone was not one person. It was Vivian. It was his daughters. It was June. It was the musicians, relatives, and rescuers who stood near the blast and learned that loving a legend can feel like holding a match too long. Cash wore black for the wounded. Some of the wounded were inside his own house. To understand that, we cannot begin at Folsom Prison. We cannot begin with June. We cannot even begin with the pills. We have to go back to Arkansas, before the black suit, before the mugshot, before the voice became famous enough to make wreckage sound holy. Back to the first wound Johnny Cash never stopped carrying, and the brother who did not come home. Before Johnny Cash became the man in black, he was J.R. Cash, a boy in Dyess, Arkansas, not an icon, not a preacher in black, not a walking American contradiction. Just a child in a poor farming family where work was not character building, it was survival. The Cash children worked in cotton fields. They sang while they worked, because sometimes singing is the only way a hard day lets you breathe. That matters. The voice did not begin in a studio. It began in fields, churches, kitchens, and porches, where poor people turned pressure into sound. Then came Jack. Johnny's older brother was the one family memory often held up as gentle, good, and spiritually serious. Johnny loved him deeply. Jack was not just a brother, he was a measure, a better version. A boy Johnny could admire before he had any idea strangers would one day admire him. In 1944, Jack went to work at a sawmill. Johnny went fishing. That sentence followed him for the rest of his life. Jack was badly injured by a table saw and died about a week later. Johnny was 12. There are losses that end a childhood. This was one of them. A boy goes fishing, a brother goes to work. Only one comes home. Johnny carried guilt from that day. Whether that guilt was fair is almost beside the point. Childhood guilt does not wait for logic. It moves in fast and starts calling itself truth. That is where Cash's darkness began to sound believable. Not as costume, as weather. But a wound can explain a man without excusing him. That distinction matters. Cash would spend years singing about sin, death, judgment, mercy, and the long road back. People heard truth in those psalms because truth was there. But the death of Jack did not make Johnny harmless. It made him haunted. And haunted people can still hurt the living. That is the part sentimental biographies usually step around, very politely, as if pain becomes sacred once enough people buy the record. No. Pain becomes dangerous when nobody around it can tell where the song ends and the damage begins. The boy who lost Jack would grow into a man who understood grief better than most performers ever could. Then he would meet a young woman named Vivian. And for a while, it looked like love might give the wound somewhere safe to rest. It would not. Vivian Liberto met Johnny Cash before the legend knew how to stand. That is important. She did not fall in love with the man in black. There was no prison album, no black suit with meaning stitched into it, no outlaw myth, no voice shaking arenas like thunder. There was a young serviceman. There was a roller skating rink in San Antonio. There was attraction, distance, and then letters. A lot of letters. Cash served in the Air Force, and while he was overseas, he and Vivian wrote to each other constantly. Paper made the romance look disciplined. Ink made promises look permanent. Envelopes turned longing into evidence, very dangerous evidence. When he came home, they married. They moved to Memphis. He sold appliances. Imagine that for a second. One of the most recognizable voices in American music trying to sell refrigerators. Show business had not yet learned to fear him. At night, Cash played with local musicians. Then he walked into Sun Records, where Sam Phillips was building a new sound out of poor boys, nerves, rhythm, and microphones that seemed to recognize trouble. Cash wanted to sing gospel. Phillips wanted something he could sell. There is one of the first little jokes of Cash's career. Heaven was nice, but sin had better commercial timing. Cash came back with songs that fit the room. Cry, Cry, Cry broke through. Folsom Prison Blues followed. Then came I Walk the Line. A song about faithfulness, a song about restraint, a song about staying true. Naturally, Life heard that and laughed. The record became huge. Cash became more than a husband trying to make it. He became a touring man, a wanted man, a voice strangers could claim without having to live with him. Vivian had married Johnny. The country wanted Cash. That difference would cost her. At first, success looked like rescue, money, opportunity, a name, a way out of ordinary life. But fame is not just applause. Fame is a machine that teaches one member of a family to orbit somewhere else. Vivian built a home. Cash built a career. The road took his nights, his body, his mood, and soon his judgment. Then the road brought pills. Then it brought distance. Then it brought June Carter. But before America chose the love story it preferred, there was already a wife at home, listening to a man sing about staying on the line while he was stepping over it. I Walk the Line made Johnny Cash sound like a man fighting temptation. That was the genius of it, and the warning. The song worked because temptation was not imaginary. Cash knew the pull. The road, the women, the applause, the loneliness, the schedule, the little chemical help that promised to keep the body moving when the soul had already fallen behind. America heard a vow. Vivian had to live with the man making it. Those are two very different audiences. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, Cash was touring constantly. Success demanded motion. The road became another household, and it was jealous. It wanted his nights, his attention, his health, and the version of himself his real family could not always reach. Pills entered the story the way pills usually do. As help. Help staying awake. Help getting through another show. Help surviving another drive, another stage, another city. Another room full of people who wanted the man in the spotlight and did not care what it cost the man off stage. Very generous little pills. They loan you energy and collect your life as interest. Cash became unpredictable. He drank. He used amphetamines. He burned through his body while the audience heard strength. The deeper he sank, the more the legend collected material. This is the ugly bargain. Artists can turn damage into art. Families are left trying to turn damage into breakfast. For Vivian, Cash's rise meant public pride and private humiliation arriving together. She had children. She had a husband becoming famous for emotional truth while hiding too much truth from home. Then June Carter became more than a voice in the same world. June was not a cartoon villain. That would be cheap and false. She was talented, funny, seasoned, and born into country music royalty. She understood timing. She understood the stage. She understood Cash. Maybe too well. The attraction between Johnny and June became one of country music's great romantic legends. But legends are built by choosing what stays outside the frame. Outside this frame was Vivian. Outside this frame were the children. Outside this frame was the woman who had written the letters, kept the house, and watched a song about faithfulness turn into a cruel kind of joke. Then came El Paso. A drug arrest. A courthouse photograph. And the moment Johnny Cash's private wreckage reached out and grabbed his wife too. The El Paso arrest was supposed to be Johnny Cash's shame. It became Vivian's punishment. In 1965, Cash was arrested after returning from Juarez with a large supply of pills. The drugs were no longer rumor, mood, or backstage whisper. They were physical, countable, evidence. A suitcase can hold clothes. It can also hold the thing destroying a family. That is the kind of symbol documentary writers pray for and real families suffer through. Vivian went to stand beside him. Think about that. After the tours, the absences, the pills, the rumors, the public embarrassment, she still showed up. She came to El Paso because that is what wives are expected to do when the husband has made the disaster. Stand there, look loyal, absorb the weather. Then a photographer took a picture outside the courthouse. Vivian's features and complexion led some people to assume she was black. In 1960s America, that was not a harmless misunderstanding. It was dangerous. Interracial marriage was still illegal in many states, and white supremacists used the photograph to attack the Cash family. Johnny had been caught with pills. Vivian was dragged into a racial firestorm. That is what the title means. Johnny Cash hurt a lot more than himself. His addiction put him in the courthouse. The camera put Vivian in the crosshairs. The country did the rest. Because America has always been efficient when cruelty and race can share the same room. Cash later became known as a man who stood with outsiders. Good. But in this moment, the outsider was his own wife. She was frightened, she had children, she had a home already damaged by distance and addiction. Now strangers were sending hatred into it because of a photograph she never asked to become part of. That is not a love song. That is collateral damage. The arrest did not destroy Cash's career. If anything, it added grit to the image. A little danger, a little outlaw smoke, a little more darkness for the legend to wear. Very marketable. But at home, the marriage was nearly gone. The letters from the Air Force years now belonged to another life. The next document would not carry a promise. It would carry an ending. The divorce papers were coming. Vivian Liberto did not fit neatly into the Johnny Cash myth. That was her problem. The myth needed Johnny and June. It needed rescue. It needed duets. It needed the wild man steadied by the right woman. A cleaner story. A better movie poster. A romance with music already built in. Vivian made that story complicated. She was not a villain. She was not a footnote. She was the first wife, the woman from the letters, the mother of his daughters. The person who knew Johnny before the black suit became armor and before the audience learned to clap for his pain. By 1966, the marriage was over. Drug abuse, infidelity, and absence had done their work. Divorce is often described as paperwork, but paperwork is only grief that learned how to file itself. For Cash, the collapse of the first marriage became part of the road toward redemption. For Vivian, it was not a plot point. It was a life. The children did not watch a neat story about a troubled genius finding his true partner. They watched a father leave, return, disappear, struggle, and grow larger in public while becoming harder to hold at home. That is the part celebrity culture hates. Children do not experience fame as mythology. They experience it as absence. A tour bus leaving, a phone call missed, a mother tired, a photograph in the paper, a stranger saying something cruel about a family they do not know. Cash loved his children. That is not the issue. Love and damage can live in the same house. Sometimes they even use the same voice. That is what makes the story harder. Johnny Cash was not empty. He could be tender, funny, generous, spiritually serious. He could sing with a moral force that made strangers feel less alone. But the people closest to him still paid. That is the contradiction. A man can give comfort to millions and still fail the people at breakfast. America prefers the first part. Families remember the second. After the divorce, Cash moved toward June Carter more openly. The rescue story began to take shape. June would become the woman who helped pull him from the edge, the partner on stage and off, the person audiences wanted to believe had finally brought him home. But the question does not go away. When a man is saved, what happens to the people damaged before the rescue? June Carter was about to learn that saving Johnny Cash was not a clean job. June Carter did not receive a healed Johnny Cash. She received a man still burning. That is the part the love story often polishes. Cash proposed to June on stage in 1968. That same year, he recorded at Folsom Prison and rebuilt his public power. The timing looks almost too perfect. The prison album, the proposal, the comeback, the woman who finally helped the wounded man stand upright. Hollywood could not have arranged it better. Eventually, Hollywood basically did. But life was messier. June was not simply the angel who rescued the sinner. She was a working artist with her own family history, her own career, her own nerves, and her own price to pay. Loving Johnny Cash meant stepping into a storm that had already damaged one home. That takes courage. it also takes a toll. Cash did get better at times. He fought addiction. He leaned on faith. He leaned on June. He leaned on the Carter family. He tried to rebuild himself in public and private. But addiction is not a movie villain that dies after one emotional scene. It waits. It bargains. It comes back wearing a familiar face. Cash would struggle again. Pills returned at different points. Health problems came. The old patterns did not vanish because a crowd cheered a proposal. Very inconvenient for the redemption industry. June became partner, guardrail, performer, wife, and witness. From the audience, that can look romantic. Up close, it can be exhausting. The duet sounded joyful. The house still had to survive the man. That is not an insult to their love. Their bond was real. Their musical chemistry was real. Their marriage lasted. They helped each other create a second version of the Johnny Cash story. But real love does not erase the damage around it. Sometimes it simply stays long enough to see all of it. Cash's black suit now carried meaning. He wore it for the poor, the prisoner, the beaten down, the forgotten. That image mattered because he meant it. But symbols can hide the person wearing them. The man in black could speak for prisoners. The husband still had to answer to the living. Then came Folsom, the microphone, the inmates, the roar, and the moment America began mistaking Johnny Cash's empathy for proof that all the damage had been paid for. Folsom Prison did not make Johnny Cash dangerous. It made him sacred. That is a very different thing. On January 13, 1968, Cash walked into Folsom State Prison and recorded one of the most important live albums in American music. The room was electric. Inmates shouted. Cash leaned into the tension. The songs sounded like they belonged behind concrete walls. America heard it and believed. Here was a star who did not sing down to prisoners. He sang toward them. That mattered. Cash had sympathy for men society preferred to bury alive. He treated them as listeners, not props. His prison concerts helped shape his image as the artist of the condemned, the guilty, the poor, and the locked away. That was powerful. It was also useful, because the more Cash became a voice for the imprisoned, the more his own chaos looked meaningful. Arrests, pills, wreckage, darkness, all of it could be folded into a larger myth of sin and mercy. Very efficient. Pain went in. Legend came out. The problem is that empathy does not cancel accountability. Cash could sing for prisoners and still leave Vivian with fear. He could understand guilt and still cause it. He could wear black for the forgotten and still forget people in his own orbit. That does not make the prison work false. It makes the man complicated. And complication is where the real story lives. After Folsom came San Quentin. Bigger applause, bigger myth, bigger proof that Cash could stand in front of America's outcasts and sound like one of them, even though he had never lived their sentences. He had been arrested. He had spent nights in jail, but the outlaw image was larger than the record. That is show business. It takes a misdemeanor, adds lighting, and sells a moral earthquake. By 1969, the man in black was no longer just a singer. He was a national symbol, a man who could move from prison stages to television screens, from scandal to moral authority, from private wreckage to public meaning. But symbols are hungry. They keep eating human details. And in Johnny Cash's case, those human details had names: Vivian, Roseanne, Kathy, Cindy, Tara, June. The next stage would put him in America's living rooms. His own home was still sorting through the wounds. Television did something remarkable for Johnny Cash. It made the outlaw safe enough for families. That is a nice trick. Put the man in black under studio lights, give him guests, give him a network slot, let America watch from the couch, and suddenly danger becomes programming. The Johnny Cash Show began in 1969. Cash brought country, folk, gospel, rock, and political tension into American living rooms. He could stand beside legends and newcomers. He could give airtime to voices that did not always fit cleanly into network comfort. That part deserves respect. Cash was not only a wrecking ball. He was a bridge. But bridges can still have cracks. The same man who looked steady on television still carried the history behind him. The pills, the arrests, the divorce, the children, the private cost of becoming publicly beloved. This is what makes Cash fascinating. He was never only one thing. He could be reckless and principled, selfish and generous, a sinner and a preacher, sometimes in the same afternoon. He could break trust and then sing about truth with enough force to make people believe in it again. That is not hypocrisy exactly. It is worse and more human. It is contradiction. His daughter Roseanne would become an artist in her own right, and the daughters from his first marriage had to live with a father the whole country thought it knew. Imagine that burden. Your private father belongs to strangers. They have opinions about his pain. They have favorite songs. They have posters. They have no idea what it was like to wait. Fame turns family into background, unless the family speaks, and even then, the myth usually speaks louder. In the later decades, Cash's career rose, fell, and rose again. There were health problems, relapses, religious commitments, forgotten records, strange appearances, and then the stark late career revival with Rick Rubin. The old voice returns stripped down, no shine, no costume needed, just age, regret, faith, and a room quiet enough to hear the bones. Then came Hurt. A cover song became a confession, and suddenly the man who had hurt more than himself sounded like he was finally reading the bill. When Johnny Cash sang Hurt near the end of his life, it did not sound like performance. It sounded like inventory. The video showed an old man surrounded by memory, awards, photographs, empty rooms, a table full of evidence from a life too large to cleanly explain. That is why it hit so hard. Cash no longer looked like the outlaw selling danger. He looked like a man sitting inside the consequences. The young voice had made pain sound powerful. The old voice made it sound expensive. By then, Cash had outlived many versions of himself. The farm boy, the Sun Records rebel, the absent husband, the addicted touring star, the prison singer, the television host, the Christian witness, the washed-up legend, the American recordings ghost with a guitar. June Carter Cash died in May 2003. Johnny followed in September. The love story received its final, devastating shape. Two people bound by music, faith, endurance, and a history no clean romance can fully hold. But the title still stands. Johnny Cash hurt a lot more than himself. That does not mean he was only a destroyer. That would be lazy. He also gave people courage. He sang for those pushed outside respectability. He made prisoners feel seen. He gave working people a voice that did not sound polished for rich ears. He admitted brokenness before confession became a marketing strategy. But the damage was real too. Vivian was real. The daughters were real. June's burden was real. The pills were real. The courthouse photograph was real. The lonely houses behind the famous songs were real. That is the cruel truth of Johnny Cash. The same wound that made him sing with such authority also spread through the people close enough to love him. The world prefers redemption because redemption feels finished. But human damage does not end just because the final chorus lands. Cash became the man in black for the poor, the prisoner, and the beaten down. And maybe that is why the story still hurts. Because some of the beaten down were not strangers in a prison yard. Some of them were waiting for him at home. Johnny Cash did not only sing about pain, he left it behind. And the hardest question is not whether he found forgiveness. The hardest question is who had to pay for it before he did.